the rational and sane people out there said it would never happen. Well, perhaps it was me, but somehow, inexplicably, the second episode of TalkiNindies has now arrived. Um, I had some positive feedback. I was shocked that there wasn't a negative feedback, though I would imagine a lot of people that listened to the first one who had no good feelings about it just sort of turned it off. So talking to the handful of people or possibly more that kept listening, thank you for coming back. And in the case of our replier this week, Dusky Azure, thank you for sending in some new questions, because if there weren't any questions, I wouldn't do this. So for the people who would like me to stop, tell all the people to stop sending me questions, and then we'll be good. So anyway, as I said, Dusky Azure had two questions, and we'll start with, I'm actually reading them out of order. We'll go with the second one first, which is, why do you think the Switch has been so successful as an indie platform? There's a couple answers, a couple thoughts I have on that. I think that up until the Switch, indie games and Nintendo didn't really connect. You would see smaller games that were on the 3DS eShop, and it did seem like Nintendo was experimenting with that kind of thing way back when, because there were smaller games. But my impression that I've gotten was that the powers that be at Nintendo weren't always, and perhaps I'm talking more about the folks back in the homeland, more so than possibly the American market. I don't think that a lot of people gave indie games a lot of credit. They thought of them as shovelware or as lesser efforts. So I think in order for the Switch to even be on the road to success, it took getting around some of that, what seemed to be some bias. And I think a big piece of the puzzle for that, having talked to him a few times, is the guy that used to be in charge of indie games at Nintendo, Kirk Scott. Talking to him, he was a passionate guy. He was really a big believer in the power of what indie games could bring to the table. And he was a real advocate, out there beating the bushes, trying to get a focus and get people's eyes on indie games and get them to take it seriously. Now, I think it helped that there were some, very good indie games that were coming out at the time earlier on. Certainly Stardew Valley would have been an example of something that sort of turned heads and made a real case that indie games could be wildly successful. But I mean, there's tons of early indie games that were obviously a boon to Nintendo. Golf Story was an early one. But there's the weird thing is, I think it was a perfect thing for Nintendo to have these indie games come along and to emphasize them, because they're a great gap filler. Because Nintendo has always sort of had this problem of, people buy Nintendo systems to play Nintendo games. Nobody's ever had any misunderstanding about that. So I think getting big third-party publishers to put stuff on Nintendo systems was always more of a challenge. And rightfully so. A big budget game made by a third party, if they feel like they're not going to get the return on the investment putting it on the system, because the likes of Mario Kart, Smash, and all those things are also on people's radar, and for the consumers of Nintendo products, those are the products that they're much more likely to buy than yours. I could see where it's tough financially to see that as a good idea sometimes for riskier, bigger games, especially where there is some effort to get it converted to run on hardware like the Switch. Versus for indies, most of them inherently aren't pushing the boundaries enough that that it's as much of a challenge to get them onto the Switch. I don't doubt, depending on what engine people are using or how they've set things up, that there could be challenges. But I think indies and Nintendo were a ideal companion to one another for those reasons, where indies would fill up the gaps, or be that thing that people would fall back on. Nintendo probably didn't have to, for a fair number of them, probably didn't have to, work so hard to get them. Getting exclusives and getting bigger ones perhaps would be an effort. But anyway, so getting back to some of the answer, and how it ties to Kirk Scott. Having been at PAX and walked the floor with Kirk a few times, the impression, he was the guy. He was out glad handing and talking to people and engaging with people, and he was genuinely interested in people that had something different and cool to see. And I think you'd see that in the earlier indie directs. There was some pretty diverse stuff on those. You'd see the quirky stuff, you'd see story-driven stuff, you'd see some action-oriented stuff. It was nice and diverse. I think I not to be too critical, because I don't know the new people or the new folks in place since Kirk left. He's no longer with Nintendo. I don't get the same feel when I see the indie directs now, at least as diverse. It seems like things have gotten to be more focused on quirk. And that's fine. There are some great quirky games out there, and there's definitely, reaching all consumers and potential people and audiences is important, and that is a big part of what I do with the site. I try to have an open mind toward every genre, every taste, every flavor, and try to, even if they aren't games that I inherently enjoy, I at least try to find the best ones in those areas to help advocate for them and get eyes on them, so that the people who are looking for those games find them. And sort of one of the concerns I have when I look at the indie directs that have come out more recently, they just don't feel as diverse as they used to. Perhaps it's better to emphasize games that are for slightly more casual players, or players that are non-traditional. They aren't people obsessed with action or shooting things or things like that. But the thing is, there are great games out there that feed to those things, whether retro games or roguelikes, and you'll see the odd ones in there. But I don't want to be too reductive. But one of the criteria for things that get into the directs over the last year or so, or more, if you have a game involving cats, those seem to do really well for getting into directs. And the thing is, there are some really interesting, cool games with cats that I don't mind. A Cat Cafe Manager wasn't too long ago, and for what it is, it's fine. But then there were games like Calico, cute, and cat oriented, but not necessarily a great game. But I felt like I feel like the criteria has gotten a little less focused on trying to find all audiences. I walk away from most of them feeling like, man, I really could have used a look at a really cool shooter or something, or a little bit more. I found, there's these great story-driven games, that's cool, and I want to play some of those, and there are very artistic games, and those are cool, and I like those. I appreciate the fact they're obviously trying to reach out to different international developers, engaging people from different countries, and because you get different flavors. I like Dandara was from a completely different, I think they were in Brazil, so that has a very different look and feel. And there have been a lot of really successful games that and not as successful, that have come from different places. So I get all that, but I don't know. I feel like there hasn't been as much meat and potatoes kind of stuff as I would prefer out there, which kind of sucks. But how that makes Nintendo successful as the Switch successful as an indie platform, um, I think they engaged early, um, heavily to get that way, and once they had the momentum, once you kept seeing news stories that once it got on the Switch, Indie Game X sold more within the first month or whatever on the Switch than it had up until that point. Like on the PC and how I got into indie games, I I actually got into them because of Humble Bundles, um, where most of the games I wasn't looking to buy, but there was one or two games in the bundle that were something that looked interesting. So then I'd go and play the other games, and usually 50% of the games that I didn't know I would like, when I played them, it was like, wow, this is really good too. So that's what really got me going. And when I think of PC, I think there are indie successes in that space, but there are so many games coming out on a weekly basis, even as many as come out on the Switch. You know, the Switch has nothing on Steam, and of course, there's a fair percentage on Steam that come out every week that are hot garbage. There are ones that come to the Switch as well that are hot garbage. But so you had this platform that there were these spiky successes. At the time, earlier on, there wasn't quite as much on a weekly basis, so there wasn't as much. Even now, there's certainly not nearly as much competition as there are on Steam. So you had engagement, you had success stories, you had a lot of people were rebuying games that they had already bought. That was a common thing where people were like, "Well, I love this game, but being able to play it portably is even better. So I'll buy it a second time and I'll double dip." Now you've got Steam Deck that's arrived. Perhaps people wouldn't have to double dip to be able to play the game they loved on playing on normal PC portably, but having seen it, I don't own a Steam Deck, but having seen and held one of those bad boys, that's a very different product. It is a bulky, chunky boy. So whether or not the Steam Deck is really gonna threaten the Switch is definitely a fair question. But it seems until there's a newer iteration that's a bit more svelte and not as chunky and heavy, and it seems like they're competing for very different spaces, at least for now. But we'll see what happens in the future if they do another iteration, and then what Nintendo does in the future as well. But so having taken all those different things about the elements of why I think Nindies were successful, why indie developers I think found the Switch to be compelling, and why on the Switch side of things or the Nintendo side of things, in the early on period, I can directly verify having seen it and been there and talked to indie developers and sort of watched Kirk work, or there were cases where I'd be on the floor and I would see some game that looked really cool, and I would be sure to check back in with Kirk and be like, did you see this game? And then he would send me ones where it was a game I hadn't seen yet, and he's like, yeah, you really need to go to see this booth. So it was really interesting watching how I never appreciated how the business works. And granted, this isn't working at the bigger scale, so it's not somebody at Nintendo trying to woo Capcom into doing something like that. It's smaller scale, but yeah, watching Kirk work, and he was a really really naturally friendly and gregarious kind of guy. Watching him work was impressive. He was able to charm people and try to twist arms and be like, yeah, let's make this happen, type of thing. I really think that was a big piece of the success before they saw the successes of people who are hitting, hitting big numbers. I think somebody like Kirk reaching out and taking a very direct interest in bringing people in probably contributed a lot, and I think he also contributed on the Nintendo side, helping to make a case that indie games should have a dedicated space. So, I don't know what the origin of the indie directs were, whether he was a big advocate, whether or not there were people who were just as interested as he was. But I think having a marketing strategy that included, rather than creating big directs where you'd lose the indies, to some big announcement from Nintendo or some big announcement from a third-party developer, when you had a dedicated direct just for the indies, I think it really showed a commitment and a belief in how indies could be important, and they were reaching new audiences. And I think, the Switch has been successful greatly, just like the Wii, because of the fact that it reached out to audiences that maybe feel underserved, with diverse games. I mean, Nintendo's always been good about that with the E-rated games, etc., that just about anybody should be able to enjoy. But I think indies represent another piece of that puzzle, including by offering much more mature choices and things like that. It's like it fills up the library with all these diverse things, so that really it feels like with the Switch, if there's a specific type of game you like, even if you're a casual player who only likes tablet games, there are definitely games that a lot of them are on mobile, but there are games that aren't necessarily on mobile, or perhaps aren't as good an experience. Nintendo's just got a bit of everything. So I think the Switch being portable, the price, seeing the great success of earlier games, it's like, once everybody figured out that the Switch had the potential to open the door to new people, or new purchases, or people repurchasing, it just was a convergence of a lot of elements that I think helped make it very successful. Hopefully that answers that question. Certainly took long enough. So the other question, what are my top 5 roguelike indies? I mean, it would be wrong to talk about indies. I mean, obviously, I have a list on the site of currently. The last one I made was 70 of my top roguelikes. So you can get a fair idea of what I consider to be the best ones around. And obviously, to some degree, they're in order of what I consider the best. So I mean, at the top of the list, on that list, you've got Hades and Dead Cells, 2 games that I don't really need to expound upon or throw any more bones toward. They're both excellent games. Of the 2, I mean, Hades is amazing in the feel, the fluidity of the combat is just unreal. Though I do think I like Dead Cells a bit better of the 2, but I don't want to really dwell on those, because I think that those are, like I said, they have had more than enough coverage and people, shouting from the rooftops about them. So instead of including those, I'm gonna go a little lower on the list, just to change things up and bring some light to other games that I love that I think are a little bit more in need of some love, because I think there are people that like them, but Dead Cells and Hades are on a different level. So the first one that I've got is Children of Morta. It's got very much an action RPG kind of feel, but it's definitely very roguelike, very challenging. Each of the members of the family, which you'll slowly unlock, each of them has a totally different style of play. So you've got ranged people, you've got people that are magic users and have a certain feel to them. You've got ones that feel very strategic, where you're going to be concerned with where your placement is, where things are, and set things up to bring you success. But you also have people that can melee. You got fast melee. You've got sort of a hulking big hit kind of melee. So the thing I loved about it was it has an interesting story. The art style's pretty cool. Um, Getting to know each member of the family as you unlock them and as you see them interact as you get further into the game is just has a cool feel to it. But it's just it challenges you to play as each class, play as each type of person, and you're not going to like all of them. I think the kid with the twin blades, I wasn't really a fan of, but you know, on the whole, all of them implemented very well. It's a challenging game, and it feels satisfying to play. So I was a big fan. Going a bit older school, um, and I and I don't think this is roguelike that I think there's a camp of people that love this game, and then there's everybody else who don't necessarily not like the game, but I think it's so easily dismissed because of how old it really looks old, and it is strange to play. But I love Nuclear Throne. Um, it's a game that I actually played on PC originally, and I only beat it after playing it off and on for like years. Like I loved the game, I had a great time with it, but I don't think I ever played it consistently and like dedicated enough to really try to beat the game. And then I got on a tear where I was playing it a lot, and I did finally beat it, and it felt great. Now, if you look at it, it's decidedly old school looking. It's not a looker, um, and certainly it's got a dated. I think it had a dated look even when it came out, and that was quite a long time ago now. But just the play of it, and the different characters and their different abilities change the way it plays so much, and it's just so I love it. It's just a roguelike shooter that really challenges you and feels great. There are people that would perhaps prefer something like Enter the Gungeon, which I like. I like Enter the Gungeon a lot. Its sense of style, it's very strange enemies, and like it's a creative and weird and cool game, but just something mechanically about playing it I don't find as satisfying as something like Nuclear Throne. Um, so that's another one. Then I would be remiss not to put Neon Abyss pretty high on the list as well. Um, Neon Abyss, another roguelike shooter, but this one side-scrolling type of. It's not top-down feel, and I have played the living daylights out of that game. If you look, I've got. It's probably the game I have the most videos on the site for. I have played it a lot, and originally it was a little buggy. You got slowdown. They still haven't gotten rid of the slowdown problem on large bosses, but I think part of the problem is if you get certain combination of equipment, you're going to be putting so many bullets on the screen that it's not hard to see why maybe there can be some hitch or slowdown, especially since some of the enemies put a hell of a lot of bullets on the screen. But I appreciate Neon Abyss for the bosses and the way it works. There are different ways that you're compelled to play. If you want to face Ares, you're gonna have to have a different plan than if you want to face Athena. And then once you beat them, you face Zeus. And then when they added the expansion, it's a little bit more convoluted, but you end up being able to meet yet another even bigger boss by well, I won't talk about it here. You can see videos and stuff, but it took work because I was playing it right when the patch came out, and it took work to figure out how to do that. So you face cursed versions of Ares and of Athena who are more challenging, but it just is a great feel of a game to play. The runs are a bit long. It's a good, if you are running a successful run, it's gonna take over an hour, or just about an hour. But every run is different because the equipment you find, the pets that you have, all of it make for a very different feel. Like you end up having a set of either a specific gun or certain gear that you're praying for, because sometimes the gear you get can make your life real easy, and then there's runs where you just get a horrible combination of gear, and no matter what you're gonna do, you're gonna hate life. But I have seen runs where it turns around. You start out with gear that's not so good, like something that's causing explosions close to you or something like that. But then you might get I forgot what the name of the gear is, but it looks like the Big Daddy helmet. That makes you invulnerable to explosions. So I have seen runs where you get just the right piece of gear all of a sudden, and that redeems a run, and you can turn it around. I think my favorite gun in the game is Famine. If I see Famine, I'm going to buy it. It has tracking bullets. If you get the tracking bullets combined with, there are multiple ways to make it so you can fly. Having to jump and avoid bullets, that's a lot more challenging to the brain as you have bullets all over the screen than flying. But if you can't fly, getting the gear or perks where you can do multiple jumps does help compensate. And sometimes multiple jumps is more helpful, because against the game's final toughest boss, you can't fly actually. So if you had this fly build going and you're not a good jumper, you might lose. But getting further along, and trying to stay away from shooters since I've been very shooter centric. I really like Slay the Spire. I've played quite a bit of it. Roguelike deck building is definitely, I wouldn't consider it one of my favorites, just because I don't like deck builders. I appreciate them and I'll play them for a while, but I don't get hooked or addicted to them, like some other things. But it would be wrong not to mention it. It would also be wrong not to mention Binding of Isaac, just for being the weird ass game that it is. And it is probably one of the first indie games that I played that helped make me understand how cool indie games were. Dicey Dungeons is definitely interesting. Let's see. We'll try to find stuff that I really connect with. Because these are really great games, but they're not necessarily the ones that I would pick. West of Dead, I did play quite a bit of that, and I had a good time with it. It is a roguelike shooter to some degree, but its pacing and the way it plays are just very different. It's not a twin stick shooter where you're just endlessly taking everything out. It is a paced, and it has a very distinct feel. The voice of Ron Perlman does nothing to harm the game. Obviously that makes it sound cooler, but has an interesting art style. It is hard, without a question. And like I said, it's just you have to use cover. You have to your weapons don't typically there's a balance. If you have weapons that have a lot of ammo, they can be trickier to use, or they don't do very much damage. If you've got really powerful weapons, their range tends to be really limited. You have to have something practically right in front of you. You definitely have to be a master of the dodge roll, because there are certain enemies that are just hulks that if you don't avoid them hitting you, you're gonna go down. But yeah, that really stands out to me as a game with different ideas, and it feels great, but very hard. Totally different direction. It's a roguelike Zelda kind of experience. I was a really big fan of Sparklight. Imagine Link to the Past type experience, except as a roguelike, and I really enjoyed it. I don't think I see as many people advocating for it as I would think, but that's interesting. I really appreciated another direction, so roguelike Metroidvania, or roguelike Metroid-ish, a robot named Fight. That was a challenge and very different. I really like. I love the roguelike. Way back when I wrote an editorial about roguelikes, I really love the idea of roguelikes because I don't really consider it a genre. I consider it a catalyst. So, you take a genre that and then you apply roguelike concepts to it, and suddenly it becomes something different. The most recent thing that I just did a giveaway for it, and an excellent example of it. I can't wait to see more roguelike sports games, but Curse to Golf, what a great idea. Take classic golfing, kind of thing where you've got your little power gauge, you got to hit the power right, then you have the angle gauge, and you're going to have to hit that right. That classic mechanic. Well, now let's throw these ridiculously complex and difficult holes at you with multiple levels and traps and all kinds of stuff. And then to spice it up even more, we'll give you special abilities that you can't count on. They aren't something you inherently have. You have to have them tied to cards, and the cards are random what you'll get or find in many cases. So, you have to sit there and say, okay, this is a tough shot. Am I going to try to gut it out? Should I try to use one of my special cards to control the trajectory of the thing inherently? Should I use one of the ones where if I'm confident I can at least get it into the right spot, I can make it drop instantly, or I can make it change direction? So there ends up being all this strategy on the fly as you play these courses, and there's going to be moments where you make the crazy shot that shouldn't work, but it does, and you succeed. And there's going to be plenty of those where you think you've got it and you mess up and you're just totally screwed. Just roguelikes in general. And I'd say Curse to Golf, it's not on the chart since it's new, but Curse to Golf I think will be in my top 10 for the year, and it's definitely going to get pretty high on the roguelike list, because I appreciate what it's doing, and I appreciate that it's a new idea. Like, I love roguelike shooters. I play the hell out of them, but there's a lot of them, so you have to really do something different to sort of get on my radar now. A good example that a game that does do something like that is I do like Atomic Crops a lot, and I've played a lot of it. This idea of it's a light farming sim. Not really, but it has a farming element, and it plays differently. I like variety, and I think when you look at my scores for games, some people sometimes might be a bit confused by how highly I might rate some types of games that maybe don't seem to be at a super high level of quality, and sometimes they might feel like I'm grading down certain games that are really good. But a big component to how I look at scoring is how different is this? Is this the only game like this out there? Now that doesn't give you a pass. The game still has to be compelling. But when you're the first, or you're an early exploratory force that has gone into unknown territory, and you've walked away doing something interesting and doing it reasonably well, you should get propped up, because that took some daring, and that took some guts, and it's a risk, because boy, you play quite a lot of games, or not, you might not, but I play quite a lot of games that it's a big swing. You start it up and you're like, oh, we're combining two things here. This is interesting, and it doesn't work. There's quite a lot of that, and I feel sorry for the folks that are ambitious, see an opportunity, and they swing big and they whiff. It is crushing, and I feel bad for them, but that's it's how it is. There are games that really succeed and pull it off, and there's games that they just can't pull it off. Whether or not the concept doesn't work, because that definitely is sometimes true. Games, there will be elevator pitch kind of games. When you see it described, it's like, wow, that should be a great combination. But in execution, it doesn't really work. And there are some cases where even in execution, you can't imagine that somebody would do a far better job of necessarily doing it, but you end up realizing that these two things really just don't get along very well together. So so I gave you my top, quite a lot of roguelikes. And granted, some were from lists, but obviously Curse to Golf is brand new and it can't be on the list just yet. But tried to also explain some of the rationale and how it works, because to me the interesting thing about people that I follow is I'm usually curious why they think the way they do. So whether or not it was asked, giving you a little bit of that insight into my very stream of consciousness mind. So we'll just conclude there for this episode. Thank you to Dusky Azure for submitting a question, and thank you for anybody who's taken time to listen to this far. If you wanted to keep going, people just gonna have to keep asking questions. So if there's not another one, thank you for listening. If there is, I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.